I'll show you how to take this size 14 corset pattern and resize it to your measurements using simple, beginner-friendly grading techniques. I'm using my free Sweetheart bodice block. This is the home printing version, printed at 100% scale, so it's true to size. This version doesn't include seam allowance, and for those who are beginners, seam allowance is the extra fabric you add for stitching. But I'm using this version because right now, we want to manipulate the pattern freely without worrying about those extra edges. I'm cutting out all of the pieces, separating the front panels from the back panels, and then we're going to head on over to the dress form so I can show you exactly how to take the right measurements. I'm using my custom dress form as an example, and it was made to my specific measurements, so it's a great stand-in for how these measurements work on an actual human body. I have a full tutorial on how I made it, and I'll link that on the screen somewhere, but today we're starting with 4 key measurements, and that is the waist, the bust, the overbust, and the underbust. Before we start adjusting, these measurements help us understand how our body compares to the pattern, and it'll show us exactly how much to add or subtract for a better fit. Start by wearing a snug, stretchy tank top or bodysuit that reveals your natural body lines. Look for the vertical seam along the side of the garment. You can also place a tape measure at the armpit and run it down your side all the way down to your heel. That's where your side seam should fall. Mark it with a fabric pen or tape it if it helps. Next, take your key points: bust, overbust, underbust, and waist. You'll do this again, but only for the front of your body. In this example, I'm measuring from side seam to side seam across the bust for the front. And that gives me 27¼ inch, which is about 69.2 centimeters. Then what I'm going to do is subtract this number from the total bust circumference that we got earlier to get the back measurement. You'll do this for each point of measure and record your number in the table like this. But then we'll head back to our pattern table to do a little bit of math and start adjusting. Now that we have our measurements, we're going to compare them to the measurements of our pattern block. And my fellow Americans, sorry, but from here on out, we're switching to the metric system. It's just so much easier for precise sewing math. With metric, we can mark down to the millimeter compared to the smallest mark on most tapes here, which is 1/8 inch. Fun fact, when I ran the embroidery department at Christian Dior in the US, our margin of error was less than a millimeter. So that level of precision really matters, especially in our case for corsets. If you're off by just 1/8 inch per seam, and if you got 36 possible seams, that's an accidental 4.5 inches added to your corset. So accuracy is everything. Here's what we'll do. Measure each key point of measure on every panel of your pattern. I've labeled most for you, but double check. Printing scale errors and extra paper edges can throw you off. For example, I'm off by about 1 millimeter at the bust because I left a tiny bit of black outline when I was cutting. That tiny ink line adds size. I left the overbust unlabeled on purpose because it's good practice for finding seam measurements yourself, but once measured, add them up for the total. Since we're working with a half pattern, record your number in the table as is. Next, convert your measurements in inches to centimeters if you haven't already, then divide them by 2. Finally, we'll want to subtract the pattern measurements from your body measurements to see the difference. Repeat this for each section in the table. Now that we know our measurement difference, let's figure out how to split it between our seams. I'm starting with the back because it's easier to visualize, fewer curves, and the back anchors the whole bodice. I usually divide the difference evenly across the back since I'm fairly symmetrical, but if you're asymmetrical or have specific shaping needs or even posture differences, you might distribute it unevenly. The back has 4 panels, but I avoid changing the center back and side seam to preserve the design lines. That leaves 6 seams in between. From our chart, we'll take the total difference and divide it by those 6 seams. In my case for the bust, that equals 1 centimeter to add to each seam at the bust line. If your number is negative, you'll subtract instead. To adjust, I anchor my pattern pieces at the waistline, spaced a few inches apart so that I have room to work, and then I extend the bust line. From there, I can mark 1 centimeter out or inward if you have a negative, and then you'll repeat this for the overbust, underbust, and waist on that panel. Then connect the marks with a ruler or the edge of the pattern block that you used previously. I use a French curve to smooth out any sharp points. If you don't have one, that's okay. I've linked my favorite and a free printable version you can download at home. But once that's done, you've got a new panel size, and you'll repeat this for the rest of the back. Now for the front, we'll repeat the exact same process. You'll find the measurement difference, divide it across the seams, extend our lines, and then shift the pattern to match the new points. Here's the catch though, these numbers can get extremely tiny. While accuracy matters, sometimes changes are so small they're not worth the fuss. For example, my underbust needs to be just 0.04 centimeters across all of the seams, and that's just too small to worry about. In that case, I focus on keeping a smooth, natural curve instead. The mock-up will show if the micro change matters, and if the muslin fits, you can skip the sub-millimeter tweak. For the bust, however, I'm rounding up to 1.5 millimeters, and for the waist, 2 millimeters. Your tape might not have these half marks, so just eyeball between whole numbers. As a general rule, if you're under 1 millimeter, prioritize seam flow and shaping over strict math. Your fabric and body movement will even it out. Once the pieces are redrawn, I true my seams by walking the pattern. If there's a mismatch, adjust until they're even. Mine match pretty closely, so I'm ready to add the seam allowance. I prefer 1/2 inch because that's how I was trained, but I know many home sewists like 5/8 of an inch, so choose whatever works for you. When working with corsets, it's a matter of how you're gonna finish the garment, whether you're gonna create separate boning channels or if you're gonna sew boning into the side seam. So truly just do what works best for your design. From there, you can cut your new pattern and move on to making your sample. Now I'm gonna cut out my muslin sample with the same careful precision as we were doing before. I'm using a regular pen to mark, which I wouldn't do on your good fabric. For that, I always use fabric markers, but in this case, I'm using muslin, so it's okay. But I like to trace my pattern onto the fabric instead of cutting directly with the paper pin down, because for me, pins and rotary cutters can cause the fabric to shift and distort. Personally, tracing helps me stay as precise as possible, but do whatever method works for you. Just a heads up though, fabric markers and pens add a little extra width, so when you cut, like I mentioned before, make sure that you trim off that marking. Next, you'll sew all the vertical seams and press them as flat as possible. Don't forget to press the 1/2 inch seam allowance in the waist and the neckline though. This helps you see exactly how it sits on the body. Muslin can be tricky to press perfectly, but do your best. A tailor's ham is amazing for curvy seams. But then we'll head on over to the dress form to check the fit. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this. Definitely a successful grade. The balance and alignment look pretty good. Center front and center back line up with the body, and there's no gaping at the neckline and no pulling in the bust, which is something that I was really concerned about, knowing that my body is a little bust heavy. That said, these are very traditional grading rules, and while shifting the pattern by standard increments is a common method, there's still room to improve the fit. Vertical length matters too. Whether you're tall or petite, the torso length needs to be right. In the sample, both the front and back are longer than needed. This means that it'll probably be digging up in the armpits, and we don't want that. To fix this, I would just shorten the torso in the pattern. To do that, I would find the midpoint on all of my patterns between the waist and the underbust. From there, I would draw a line, and I would call this our shortening line. Next, I would cut that line so that it splits the pattern into 2 pieces, and then I would shift my pattern down until the total distance between the waist and the underbust measures the same as mine. And if you are extending your torso, you would just shift it in the opposite direction. I think this length adjustment will fix a lot of the horizontal lines you see in the waist and underbust. You'll also notice that while the bust is sitting in the right spot, we lose a lot of coverage in the cleavage. And for a heavy chest, gravity can lower the apex over time, which can affect coverage and shaping. So how do we adjust for that? These are more advanced grading techniques, and if you want me to cover them, drop a comment below. Leave the word gravity. Yeah, leave the word gravity and I'll know you want me to talk about these advanced techniques. But fitting doesn't have to be overwhelming. You just need the right tools and resources and a little bit of patience. But if you're thinking this is way too much work, I totally understand. Don't worry. I've graded this pattern actually for sizes 14 to 32, and you can grab it using the link in the description so you can start a little bit closer to your size. But I hope this video helped you, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you in the next one.